Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. A Symphony Beneath the Stars. The evening city hummed with life as a soft drizzle blurred the amber glow of streetlights. Eleanor Hastings stood at the edge of the square, her worn leather boots reflecting the light like dim stars. The air smelled of wet pavement and roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. Her violin case hung heavy on her shoulder, but her heart was light. Tonight was the night she would finally play her melody to an audience, not just the empty corridors of her apartment. Across the square, a figure lingered by the fountain, a man in a navy trench coat, his face obscured by the brim of his fedora. He was sketching furiously on a notepad, glancing up every few seconds to capture the fluid movements of the city. Eleanor noticed him only in passing as she set up her stand beneath the largest lamppost. She tuned her violin meticulously, oblivious to the whispers of onlookers gathering in the periphery. As the first note escaped her strings, the square seemed to exhale. Conversations hushed, footsteps slowed, and even the fountain's gurgle felt softer. Her music wove a tapestry of longing and discovery, drawing people like moths to a flame. Yet it wasn't the crowd that held her attention. It was the man by the fountain. His sketching had stopped. He was now watching her, his pencil poised midair, as though afraid to disturb the spell she had cast. When she finished her piece, the applause was thunderous. Eleanor offered a shy smile, her gaze drifting toward the man again. But he was gone, his place by the fountain empty, save for the faint impression of his presence on the damp stone. The next evening, Eleanor found herself in the same square, compelled by a force she didn't understand. This time, she played a lively tune, a jig she had learned from her grandmother in the Irish countryside. Laughter bubbled from the crowd, and children danced in circles. And there he was again, the man with the fedora, standing farther back, but unmistakably watching her. When she finished, he approached, his footsteps deliberate yet hesitant. Up close, his features were sharp, but softened by a kind expression. His eyes, a stormy gray, met hers. "Your music," he began, his voice low and gravelly. "It's like catching a dream in broad daylight." Eleanor's cheeks flushed. "And your sketches?" She nodded toward the notepad tucked under his arm. "They seem to capture more than what's visible." He smiled faintly. "A trade, then? Music for art?" Intrigued, Eleanor agreed. She handed him a crumpled receipt to sketch on, while she played a quiet, soulful piece. His pencil moved like lightning, and when he was done, he handed her a sketch. A portrait of her lost in her music, ethereal and raw. "Call me Ezra," he said, tipping his hat before disappearing into the crowd. Their meetings became a routine. Eleanor would play, and Ezra would sketch. Slowly, they began to talk between performances. She learned he was an architect who found inspiration in the city's chaos. He learned she was a self-taught musician, playing to heal wounds she didn't dare name. One night, as the city lay under a blanket of stars, Ezra took her to a rooftop he claimed was his secret sanctuary. They sat on the edge, overlooking a sea of lights, sharing stories in silence. It was then that Ezra asked a question that hung between them like a fragile thread. "Why do you always play alone?" Eleanor hesitated. "Because when I play for others, it feels like I matter, like I exist." Ezra's gaze didn't waver. "You matter, even when the music stops." His words stayed with her long after that night. They continued to meet, their connection deepening into something unspoken yet undeniable. On a crisp winter evening, Eleanor arrived at the square only to find it unusually empty. No Ezra, no audience. Confused, she waited, her violin case at her feet. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. Eventually, a man approached. Not Ezra, but someone wearing his hat. "Are you Eleanor Hastings?" he asked, his tone somber. She nodded, her heart sinking. The man handed her a letter, his expression unreadable. Trembling, she opened it. "Eleanor, life has a way of scattering us like leaves, and sometimes the wind is stronger than our will to stay. I didn't want to leave without saying goodbye, but time wasn't kind to me. Your music healed a part of me I thought was lost forever. Keep playing, not for the world, but for yourself. Ezra." Tears blurred her vision as she read and reread the letter. When she looked up, the man was gone, leaving her alone beneath the lamppost. For weeks, she didn't play. The square felt hollow without him. Then, one evening, she opened her violin case and found a small, folded paper tucked inside. It was a sketch, a rooftop, a cityscape, and two figures sitting on the edge. Ezra's sanctuary. Their sanctuary. Eleanor smiled through her tears, lifted her violin, and played the first note of a melody she had never written down but knew by heart, a symphony beneath the stars, for a man who had taught her that even silence could sing. Chapter 2. The Whisper of Shadows. Winter melted reluctantly into spring, but the chill in Eleanor's heart lingered. She kept playing in the square, though the music felt heavier, more deliberate. Ezra's absence was a quiet wound she carried, but she poured it into every note, her melodies deepening into something both mournful and resilient. One evening, as the soft twilight bathed the city, Eleanor finished her piece to polite applause. She bowed, her smile strained, and began packing up her violin. As she latched the case shut, a voice behind her froze her in place. "You've gotten better." Her heart raced. Turning sharply, she saw not Ezra, but a young woman with strikingly familiar eyes, stormy gray, piercing yet gentle. She was tall, her dark curls framing a face etched with curiosity and pain. In her hands was a worn sketch pad, its corners frayed. "Who?" Eleanor began, her voice trembling. "My name is Alina," the woman said, her voice steady. "I'm Ezra's sister." They sat at a nearby cafe, a tiny place tucked into the corner of the square, its walls lined with mismatched bookshelves. Alina clutched a cup of tea, staring into its depths as though it held answers. "Ezra spoke about you," she began. "He said your music was the only thing that ever made him feel alive." Eleanor swallowed hard. "Why did he leave? Where is he?" Alina hesitated, her fingers tightening around the cup. "Ezra, he was sick. For years. He hid it well, but it caught up to him. When he realized he didn't have much time left, he came home. To us. He didn't want you to see him fade." Eleanor's breath hitched. The words felt like a storm breaking inside her, each one striking a chord of grief and anger. "He could have told me," she whispered. "He wanted to," Alina said softly. "But Ezra, he always believed in leaving beauty behind, not pain." She reached into her bag and pulled out the sketch pad, sliding it across the table. "These are for you. He drew them in his final days. Every one of them is you." Eleanor opened the sketch pad with trembling hands. Page after page revealed charcoal portraits. Her playing beneath the lamppost, laughing in mid-conversation, sitting on the rooftop with her hair tousled by the wind. The final drawing stopped her cold. It was of her standing alone, her violin at her side, staring into a vast horizon of stars. Beneath it, in Ezra's elegant handwriting, were the words, "Play, and I'll always listen." That night, Eleanor climbed to the rooftop Ezra had shown her. The city sprawled below, its lights flickering like restless fireflies. She set the sketch pad beside her and opened her violin case. Her fingers trembled as she began to play. Not the haunting melodies of her grief, but something new. A piece she hadn't yet written, one that grew with every note. It was hopeful, raw, and alive. She imagined Ezra there beside her, his pencil flying over paper, capturing the music in lines and shadows. And then she saw it. A single sketch fluttering from the pages she hadn't noticed before. Picking it up, she gasped. It was the rooftop, drawn from her perspective, but in the sketch, a figure stood across from her. Ezra, his hand extended as if waiting for her to join him. The days passed, and Eleanor found herself drawn to Alina in unexpected ways. The two spent hours walking the city, sharing stories of Ezra, his quirks, his brilliance, his maddening habit of disappearing for hours to chase inspiration. Alina revealed her own struggles, her guilt for not being closer to her brother in his final years. Together, they began a project, turning Ezra's sketches and Eleanor's music into a gallery installation. It became a labor of love, each piece a tribute to the man who had connected them. The centerpiece of the exhibit was the rooftop sketch, paired with a recording of the melody Eleanor had played that night. The gallery opening was a quiet triumph. People wandered through the space, drawn to the raw intimacy of Ezra's art and Eleanor's music. At the end of the evening, Eleanor and Alina found themselves alone in the gallery, standing before the rooftop sketch. "I think he'd be proud," Alina said, her voice soft. Eleanor nodded. "He'd say we made the chaos beautiful." As they turned to leave, the gallery lights dimming behind them, a strange sensation washed over Eleanor. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw Ezra's silhouette reflected in the glass door, his hat tilted just so, his hand raised in farewell. But when she blinked, it was gone. Months later, Eleanor returned to the square. She stood beneath the lamppost, her violin case at her feet. As she began to play, a figure emerged from the crowd, a young boy clutching a familiar sketch pad. He approached hesitantly, holding it out to her. This was my father's. He said it belonged to someone who could bring it to life. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding. Your father? The boy smiled faintly. His name was Ezra. Eleanor's world tilted. She knelt, her eyes meeting the boy's. Ezra was. She couldn't finish, her voice breaking. He told me to find you, the boy said simply, and to tell you he was always listening. Tears streaming down her face, Eleanor hugged the boy, her grief mixing with an inexplicable sense of joy. She stood, lifting her violin, and began to play once more, her music soaring into the night. For the first time in months, the square felt whole again. Chapter 3. The Echo of Forever. The boy's name was Micah. He had Ezra's stormy gray eyes and a quiet intensity that made him seem older than his years. He couldn't have been more than 10, yet when he spoke, it felt as though the weight of Ezra's wisdom lived within him. Micah explained that his mother, Ezra's estranged love from years ago, had told him stories of a woman whose music had captured his father's heart. A woman who, Ezra believed, could turn sorrow into something eternal. Eleanor couldn't comprehend it at first. Ezra had a son, a part of him she had never known existed. Micah became a frequent visitor to the square, sitting cross-legged by the fountain as Eleanor played. He brought with him a quiet presence, sketching crude but earnest drawings of her, the crowds, and the square. Every evening when she finished, they would talk about Ezra, about art, and about the quiet ache of missing someone who shaped their lives so profoundly. One night, as they packed up, Micah hesitated. Do you think people leave us because they have to, or because they're afraid to stay? Eleanor looked at him, startled by the question's depth. She crouched to meet his gaze. Sometimes it's both. Sometimes staying feels impossible, even if you want to. But that doesn't mean they stop loving you. Micah nodded thoughtfully. That's what my mom says, too. As spring matured into summer, Alina joined their evenings. The three of them formed an unusual family of sorts, bonded by their shared grief and the man who had woven their lives together. Micah began to thrive in their company. He took to sketching beside Alina, her guidance refining his raw talent. Meanwhile, Eleanor taught him music, his small hands learning to mimic hers on a borrowed violin. It was during one of these lessons that Micah suddenly stopped, his bow trembling against the strings. Dad told me something once, he said softly. He said the most beautiful things in life are the ones we can't hold on to forever. Eleanor's breath caught. He was right, she said after a moment, but sometimes the most beautiful things leave pieces of themselves behind. Micah smiled faintly, his hand steadying on the violin. Like music. Exactly like music, Eleanor replied. One evening, Alina arrived at the square with an envelope in hand. I've been putting this off, she said, her voice wavering, but I think it's time. Inside the envelope was a letter from Ezra, addressed to both Eleanor and Alina. My dearest Eleanor and Alina, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, but don't let that be the end of my story. You both are the heartbeats of my life, the melody and the rhythm. Alina, you gave me roots, and Eleanor, you gave me wings. I've left pieces of myself with both of you, and now it's your turn to create something new. Together, you're unstoppable. Take care of Micah. Teach him how to see the world as we did, not as it is, but as it could be. And when the weight of absence feels unbearable, remember this. I never truly left. I'm in the music, the sketches, the stars, and the laughter you share. Play for me, sketch for me, live for me. Forever listening. Ezra tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she read the letter aloud. Alina's hand found hers, and for a long time they sat in silence, the words a balm and a burden. That summer, the three of them, Eleanor, Alina, and Micah, traveled to places Ezra had loved and sketched, retracing his journey through the city and beyond. They visited the rooftop sanctuary, where they lit candles and shared stories, their laughter echoing into the night. Eleanor and Alina decided to hold a second gallery exhibit, this time featuring both Ezra's original works and Micah's burgeoning talent. The centerpiece was a collaborative piece, a portrait of Ezra, sketched by Alina, with a background of Eleanor's violin music recorded by Micah himself. The exhibit drew hundreds, but it wasn't the acclaim that mattered. It was the people, strangers, friends, and family, who left feeling changed, inspired, and connected. One night, months later, Eleanor found herself alone on the rooftop. The city was quiet beneath her, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn. She unpacked her violin, closed her eyes, and began to play. The melody was different now, not weighed down by grief, but infused with something lighter, freer. It was a song of beginnings, of finding love in unexpected places and carrying it forward. As she played, she felt a presence beside her, not physical, but unmistakable. She smiled, her music soaring into the sky, and whispered, "I know you're still listening." Below in the city square, Alina and Micah sat by the fountain, listening to Eleanor's song drift down like a blessing. Micah looked up at the stars, a quiet wonder in his eyes. "Do you think Dad hears her?" he asked. Alina smiled, ruffling his hair. "I think he always will." And as Eleanor's song filled the night, they all felt it, the echo of a love that had never truly left, resonating forever in their hearts. Chapter 4. Threads of Light. Autumn descended gently over the city, wrapping the streets in golden light and the scent of falling leaves. Eleanor, Alina, and Micah continued their shared routines, their connection deepening with each passing season. Ezra's absence had transformed from a raw wound into a presence they carried together, a quiet thread woven into the fabric of their lives. Eleanor's music had evolved in ways she couldn't have anticipated. She began composing again, her melodies blending grief, hope, and a profound sense of belonging. These new pieces found their way into small performances across the city, drawing curious crowds who often left with tears in their eyes and a sense of having witnessed something transcendent. One evening, as Eleanor prepared to perform at an intimate concert hall, Micah approached her with a folded sheet of paper. His sketches had grown more intricate, his pencil guided by a natural flair that echoed his father's. "This is for you," he said, his voice soft but steady. Eleanor unfolded the paper to find a sketch of herself standing on the rooftop, her violin raised to the sky. But this time, there was something new, a faint figure in the background, blending into the stars. Ezra, watching from the edges of the universe. "I think he's proud of you," Micah said simply. Eleanor's chest tightened. She knelt, wrapping Micah in a hug. "Of us. He's proud of all of us." The concert that night was unlike any Eleanor had ever played. She debuted a piece she had named Threads of Light, a composition inspired by Ezra, by Micah, by Alina, and by the way their lives had intertwined. As the final note faded into silence, the audience erupted in applause, but Eleanor's gaze found Alina and Micah in the front row. They were clapping the hardest, their faces glowing with pride and emotion. After the performance, the three of them walked through the square, the cool night air brimming with energy. Micah darted ahead, his footsteps echoing as he climbed onto the edge of the fountain. "Tell me about Dad again," he said, his voice carrying through the stillness. Alina laughed softly, shaking her head. "You never get tired of hearing about him, do you?" Micah grinned. "Nope." Eleanor joined in, her heart warm. "Ezra was magic. He saw the world the way it could be, not just the way it was, and he made everyone around him believe in that vision too." Micah nodded solemnly, his hands gripping the edge of the fountain. "I want to do that too. Like him." "You already do," Alina said, ruffling his hair. Winter approached again, and with it came an idea that had been quietly forming in Eleanor's mind. She shared it with Alina one evening as they sat in her apartment, drinking tea while Micah sketched by the window. "I want to create a foundation," Eleanor said. "Something in Ezra's name, for young artists, musicians, dreamers, people like him, like us, a way to keep his light alive." Alina looked at her, her eyes shining. "He'd love that." Micah perked up from his sketch pad. "Can I help?" Eleanor smiled. "Of course you can. It'll belong to all of us." They spent the winter working tirelessly, transforming their shared grief into a force of creation. The Ezra Hastings Foundation for Art and Music officially launched the following spring, its mission clear: to nurture talent, celebrate creativity, and remind the world that even the smallest sparks of beauty could illuminate the darkest nights. The Foundation's first major event was held in the square where Eleanor and Ezra had first connected. It was an open-air showcase of music and art, featuring young creators whose works echoed with raw emotion and untamed passion. Eleanor performed her newest piece, accompanied by Micah, who had grown confident enough to play beside her. His bow moved across the strings with a grace beyond his years, and as the final note faded, the crowd rose to their feet. As the applause thundered around them, Micah turned to Eleanor, his face glowing with excitement. "Do you think Dad would have liked it?" Eleanor knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "He would have loved it. And he's here, Micah. He's always here." That night, after the event had ended and the square was quiet again, Eleanor found herself drawn to the rooftop one more time. She stood alone, gazing at the city below, the faint hum of life rising like a symphony. She lifted her violin and began to play. The melody was simple, almost like a lullaby, but it carried with it everything she felt: love, loss, and an overwhelming sense of gratitude. As she played, a breeze swept through, rustling her hair. She closed her eyes, imagining Ezra standing beside her, his pencil in hand, sketching the moment. When the song ended, Eleanor lowered her violin and opened her eyes. In the distance, a single star burned brighter than the rest, its light unwavering. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carried by the wind. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt whole, not because the grief had vanished, but because she had learned to carry it as part of the love they had shared. In the square below, Alina and Micah waited, their faces turned upward, their hearts forever tethered to the music and the man who had brought them together. Chapter 5: The Star's Legacy. Spring rolled into summer, and the Ezra Hastings Foundation for Art and Music blossomed into something extraordinary. The gallery was no longer just a place to showcase art. It became a sanctuary where young dreamers gathered to learn, create, and find themselves. Eleanor, Alina, and Micah stood at its heart, guiding and inspiring with stories of Ezra, his passion, his imperfections, and his unwavering belief in beauty. Micah had grown into his own, a boy whose sketches began to reflect a maturity beyond his years. His latest piece, a sprawling mural of a cityscape filled with ethereal figures and hidden stars, became the gallery's centerpiece. "He'd be proud," Eleanor told him one afternoon, standing before the mural with Alina. Micah tilted his head, examining his work. "Do you think he'd say it's good?" Alina chuckled. "He'd say it's brilliant, but then he'd nitpick a tiny corner just to challenge you." Micah smiled, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Then I'll keep improving, for him." That summer, Eleanor began composing a symphony, a piece so ambitious it frightened her. She worked late into the nights, her apartment filled with sheets of music, half-scribbled notes, and endless cups of tea. The symphony was unlike anything she'd written before. It was Ezra's story, told through melodies that wove together moments of joy, heartbreak, and hope. She poured everything into it: the memory of his laughter, the ache of his absence, and the love that had transcended loss. Alina and Micah often visited during her late-night sessions, bringing snacks and offering moral support. Alina would sketch quietly in a corner while Micah read, the soft scratch of pencils and the rustle of pages mingling with Eleanor's music. One evening, as Eleanor played a particularly difficult passage, Micah spoke up. "It sounds like him," he said, his voice quiet. Eleanor turned to him, surprised. "What do you mean?" Micah shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "It's like I can hear him in it. The way he'd talk about things, the way he'd laugh. It feels like he's here." Eleanor's chest tightened, and she reached out to ruffle his hair. "Then I must be doing something right." The symphony's premiere was set for the first anniversary of the Foundation's opening. It would be performed at the city's Grand Concert Hall, with Eleanor conducting an orchestra for the first time in her life. The weeks leading up to the event were a whirlwind of rehearsals, nerves, and last-minute adjustments. Alina took charge of organizing the evening, while Micah helped design the program booklet, filling it with sketches of Ezra and the rooftop, alongside snippets of Eleanor's sheet music. On the night of the premiere, the hall buzzed with anticipation. The audience included friends, family, Foundation supporters, and young artists whose lives had been touched by Ezra's story. As Eleanor stepped onto the conductor's podium, her heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at the first row, where Alina and Micah sat, their faces glowing with encouragement. She raised her baton, and the symphony began. The music unfolded like a story. It began with soft, tentative notes, evoking the quiet nights in the square where Eleanor and Ezra had first met. The melodies grew brighter, filled with the wonder of discovery and the joy of connection. But then came the darker movements: grief, loss, and the unbearable silence of absence. The orchestra swelled with haunting harmonies, each note a reminder of the pain that had shaped their lives. And finally, the symphony rose into its final movement, a triumphant, soaring piece that celebrated love's resilience and the beauty left behind by those who had gone. The music filled the hall, lifting every soul in the audience, until the final note hung in the air like a promise. The applause was thunderous, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the walls. Eleanor bowed, tears streaming down her face, and turned to the orchestra, motioning for them to stand. After the performance, Eleanor, Alina, and Micah stood together in the empty hall, the echoes of the evening still lingering around them. "You did it," Alina said, her voice full of pride. "We did it," Eleanor corrected, pulling them both into a hug. Micah grinned. "Do you think he was listening?" Eleanor looked up at the star-filled sky visible through the hall's glass ceiling. "I know he was." Life continued, but it was different now, fuller, brighter. The foundation expanded, reaching artists and musicians far beyond their city. Micah's talent flourished, his work gaining recognition and admiration. Alina found her own voice in her art, creating pieces that spoke to the human spirit's resilience. As for Eleanor, she kept composing, her music carrying Ezra's light to corners of the world she had never imagined reaching. One evening, years later, Micah, now a young man, stood on the rooftop with Eleanor and Alina. The city sparkled below, the stars above mirroring its glow. Micah held a sketchpad in one hand, his pencil poised. "Tell me about him again," he said, his voice softer now, filled with the confidence and wisdom time had given him. Eleanor smiled, her violin resting at her side. "He was the kind of person who made you believe in magic, and he left just enough of himself behind for us to carry it forward." Alina added, her eyes on the horizon, "And he would have loved this moment." Micah nodded, his pencil moving across the page. When he was finished, he held up the sketch. The three of them on the rooftop, the city and stars merging in the background, and faintly, just out of reach, Ezra's figure drawn among the constellations. Eleanor lifted her violin and began to play, the melody carrying into the night. It was no longer a song of sorrow or longing, but one of celebration, a testament to a love that had shaped them all and would continue to shine like a star for generations to come. Final chapter: The Star We Followed. Years turned into decades, and the foundation became a beacon for dreamers, its impact rippling far beyond the city. The name Ezra Hastings became synonymous with creativity, resilience, and the beauty of human connection. The rooftop, the square, and the gallery turned into touchstones of inspiration, places where people found not only art and music, but also themselves. Eleanor, now with silver strands threading through her dark hair, remained the heart of it all. Her compositions had become timeless, her symphonies played in concert halls across the globe. Yet she always returned to the city, to the rooftop, where it had all begun. Alina's art had grown in depth and scope, her works displayed in museums and private collections. But her greatest masterpiece, she often said, was Micah, a boy who had become a man, carrying his father's legacy with a grace and passion all his own. The night of the Foundation's 25th anniversary was a culmination of everything they had built. The event was held in the square, where thousands gathered under a canopy of lights and stars. Eleanor had composed a new piece for the occasion, simply titled Legacy. Micah, now an accomplished artist and musician, joined her on stage. His sketches adorned the backdrop, a kaleidoscope of moments from their shared journey: the rooftop, the square, Ezra's face, and a swirling constellation of stars. As Eleanor raised her bow, a hush fell over the crowd. The first notes of Legacy rang out, weaving a tapestry of sound that told the story of love, loss, and renewal. The music rose and fell, carrying the audience through moments of joy and sorrow, triumph and quiet reflection. When the final note faded, the silence was profound. Then, like a wave, the applause began, thunderous and unending. Eleanor stood beside Micah, her hand on his shoulder, as they took their bows. Her heart was full, not with the ache of what was lost, but with the gratitude for all that had been found. Later that night, Eleanor slipped away from the crowd, climbing to the rooftop one last time. She stood at the edge, gazing at the city spread out before her, its lights shimmering like a reflection of the stars above. Micah found her there, carrying a small lantern in his hands. He set it down beside her and lit the flame, its warm glow casting flickering shadows across their faces. "I thought you might want to send one more message," he said softly. Eleanor smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I think he already knows." Micah nodded, lifting his gaze to the sky. "Do you think he ever imagined all this? That what he left behind would grow into something so infinite?" Eleanor followed his gaze, her heart swelling. Ezra never thought small. He saw the world as it could be. And because of him, we've learned to see it that way too. Together, they released the lantern, watching as it floated upward, its light joining the stars. As the lantern disappeared into the night, Eleanor closed her eyes and felt the music of her life surrounding her. It wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to Alina, to Micah, to Ezra, and to every soul they had touched along the way. For the first time in her life, she understood the fullness of Ezra's words. The most beautiful things are the ones we can't hold on to forever. And yet, in every note, every sketch, and every star, his presence remained, eternal and unbroken. Eleanor opened her eyes, her heart light and her spirit steady. "Let's go back," she said to Micah, her voice filled with quiet joy. "There's so much more to create." Hand in hand, they descended from the rooftop, carrying the light of Ezra's legacy into the future, a reminder that love, once sparked, could never truly fade. It simply transformed, shining forever in the hearts of those who dared to dream.